Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail today. We are going to share vampire encounter horror stories. First story. Escaping a vampire was the worst decision of my life. I woke up almost completely paralyzed. My head was buzzing and I felt incredibly dizzy, like I was having the worst hangover of my life. "Oh, you're awake. I see," a disembodied male voice said. My vision was still completely fogged up, so I could only see vague shapes and silhouettes. Suddenly the dizziness took over again, and I closed my eyes. "We won't fall back asleep now, won't we?" the voice said. It had a deep, slightly raspy yet soothing tone to it. I noticed how sore my arms and legs felt, and wanted to lift them up to stretch a little, but when I tried, something was holding them back. Then the thought hit me like a truck. Of course I couldn't move my limbs. I was tied to a chair. As soon as I realized that, I jolted up, or as far up as I could, and was suddenly wide awake. My vision cleared up, and I finally took in my environment. I was sat in a spacey room with a dark green carpet floor and wooden walls. To my left was a staircase leading up, and an old pool table. The room was dimly illuminated by a naked light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Finally, I turned my gaze towards the man who had been speaking to me for the past minute. In front of me sat an attractive man in his mid to late 40s. He had light brown hair and a slight stubble. His eyes were a deep brown, and despite his age, they looked so youthful and bright. His lips were turned up in a slight smile, and while some may have mistaken it for friendliness, the context made it look so sinister. I took up as much strength as I could muster up from my still intoxicated body and started violently shake my limbs in a very weak attempt to loosen my ties, but they wouldn't budge. "Nice try, buddy, but that won't work," the man said and let a light chuckle escape his lips. I opened my mouth to scream at him, but all that came out was a miserable, breathy moan. God, how could I forget? "You must be dehydrated. Wait a second." The man got up and went over to a mini fridge that was located under the stairs. He retrieved a water bottle, walked back to me and placed the bottle at my lips. I eagerly drank all of the water in one go in 30 seconds, which must have been my new record. I took one last sip and, to the man's surprise, spat at his face. "What do you want from me?" I said, half angry, half afraid. I wanted to sound threatening, but something about his face told me that he could hear my fear. "We will get to that later." He sat back down and wiped the water from his face. "Oh no, look at the mess you made." Something in his voice was too calm and playful, and something inside me told me that this was not the first time he had abducted someone. "May I know your name, please?" he asked politely, but I kept quiet. "Come on, there's no point in playing games, it was just a simple question." I still didn't say anything. "Listen, buddy, I know that you're afraid, and don't get me wrong, you have every right to be, but I am just trying to make the next hour as pleasant as possible for the both of us. Do you think it's any fun for me to be sitting in front of some bald-headed douche who just refuses to talk?" His voice sounded almost like I'd actually offended him. I gave him my sternest, most serious look that would usually get my students to shut up, and finally gave up and replied, "Mike, may I know yours too?" "Oh, I've had many names. This does not matter at all. For your well-being, I assume you don't want to spend the last hour of your life with some nameless monster. You can call me Adam." I somehow already knew that my kidnapping was not going to end well, but hearing him say it, hearing him announce my death, sent shivers down my spine. Yet I kept it to myself. I've watched multiple episodes of different crime shows, and know that a lot of kidnappers get a kick out of watching their victims fear. I closed my eyes and thought about my mother, and how she needs me and my help and my money to survive. I thought back to my brother whose wife had just given birth to a beautiful baby girl, my niece Amy. I thought about my little dog Sasquatch, who has probably been waiting for my return form work for hours. Hell, I even thought about my students and how, even though they can be a little annoying at times, I knew that a majority of them were great, intelligent kids that will turn out to be really successful once. I swallowed hard and opened my eyes again. I was a tough guy and would not start crying right here in front of my kidnapper. I would not give in. And deep down I knew, even though it was almost impossible, that I still had hope, a will to live and a strong sense of survival, and that I would at least try to flee. You know, Adam began, looking deep into my eyes. A very long time ago I was in a similar situation. For me it turned out differently than it will for you, as you may have guessed. I have no idea what the fuck you're talking about, I said, trying to sound as serious as possible. Adam chuckled. Yes, of course you don't. He squatted down so he was on my eye level, staring deep into my eyes. I am going to tell you something about me and about your fate. And while you may not believe me, it is very important that you listen to me now. A long time ago, I was in a similar position. I was kidnapped by a stranger, someone that I'd never seen before, and this man did awful, gruesome things to me. But these things changed me. At this point, I was fully convinced that Adam was part of a brutal cult that sacrificed people to their god or whatever, and I was their next chosen victim. You've heard about people like us, Mike. We've been part of legends, folklore, and even pop culture for decades. I am going to make this short for you. I am a vampire, demon, whatever you like to call it. I need human blood to survive and to stay healthy. And this is where you come into the picture. You see, I have a small family, my wife and my little boy, to provide. Once every 2 months we need to take in human blood, otherwise our health will deteriorate and we will eventually die. And as you have probably already figured out already, we need your blood. It's nothing personal, I promise. Your selection was purely random. You still have some hours left to live since I need to wait for the anesthesia I gave you to leave your blood. I'll leave you alone for those hours, so you can think about your family and friends in peace. Pray to your God or just cry, whatever it is that you want to spend your last hours with. Adam got up and walked up to the staircase, and I just sat there, completely dumbfounded and numb. This man was just batshit crazy, a lunatic, some fucked up psycho. Of course I didn't believe him 1 second. There was this small part of me that did. Adam didn't seem like a crazy person. He looked and talked completely normal, and there was this absolute seriousness in his voice when he talked to me. I quickly tried to shake off those thoughts. I'm an academic, you see. I'm not religious, never was. I'm a logical person and I know how to think critically, and I sure as hell am not going to believe Adam's impossible story. Hey! Adam snapped me out of my thoughts, and I looked back at him. He was halfway up those stairs, looked in my direction and said, I'm just trying to survive. We all are. This is just the way nature works. And with that, he went up the rest of the stairs and leave the basement. He closed the door behind him and left me to myself. The second I heard the door close, I snapped out of my trance. Whether his story was true or not, I didn't care. Fuck it. I was going to get out of here anyway. I looked around the room to find something I could use as a weapon, but I quickly realized that there were no tools or anything kept in the basement, and that it was probably mostly used for entertainment. And, you know, keeping your victims. I tugged on my bonds. There was one that tied my wrists together behind my back, and one that tied my torso to the chair's back. Nothing even budged. Those ropes were damn tight. Which was to be expected. Adam had probably perfected his bondage skills over the years. Motherfucker. No matter how much I shifted or moved, those ties didn't give in. I even tried to pull a lethal weapon and tried to dislocate my thumb, but that didn't work either. At this point, I figured that pure, mindless strength wasn't the solution. I had to figure out a clever tactic to get out of here. I had to use my mind, not my body. I shifted my weight to my left to get the chair to fall over, so that I was now lying on my left side. My new goal was not to get rid of the ties, but to get rid of the chair. Luckily, my legs weren't tied up, so I brought up my knees, put my feet down on the seat, and pushed. To my relief, it actually worked. Slowly but steadily, the chair slid out of my ties. I obviously didn't keep track of the time, but after about 5 minutes, I was free. I stood up and then looked around again, my adrenaline going through the roof. I did it. This was my first step towards survival, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be my last. With my newly gained sense of hope, combined with the adrenaline, I looked around the room for a second time, ready to look at everything for a second time. Again, I found nothing, not even sharp edges. My view then settled on the mini fridge near the pool table. I approached it and looked inside. It was mostly empty, save for a bottle of water and some beer bottles made of glass. Jackpot! I took one of the beer bottles out and tried to break them by pounding them on the fridge. Of course, I didn't have a massive range or even the ability to really move my arms, so my attempts were futile. Dropping it on the carpet floor didn't work either. Obviously, I had to rethink my tactic. I grabbed the bottle with both of my hands and started spinning, extended my arms a little, and then at some point just let go off the bottle. It flew across the room, but remained intact. But I didn't give up. I picked it up again, and again, and again. After the 5th try, it worked. The bottle hit the wooden wall and shattered into thousands of pieces. I picked up the largest one I could find and carefully started cutting up my ropes, cautious not to accidentally cut myself. This one was complicated and time-consuming, but I didn't give up. I was relentlessly cutting the rope, doing my best to tear that shit to shreds. After what felt like an eternity, I was finally able to move my hands again. I dropped the glass and looked at my hands. I'd cut myself multiple times without feeling it, probably because of the adrenaline. Now I just had one last thing to do. I walked up to the pool table and picked up the cue stick, took it in both of my hands, and broke it in 2 pieces. I kept one half with me and tossed the other one in the corner. I know, it's a wooden stick, even though I said I wasn't superstitious. But it's the only weapon I could find, and honestly, I'd better be safe than sorry, if you know what I mean. I made my way over to the staircase and hid in the space under it, and then I waited for Adam to return. I didn't care if I'd actually defeat him, but I simply knew that if I went down, I'd go down in a fight. After what must have been hours, I finally heard the door open above me. I heard Adam come down the first step stairs, but then he stopped dead in his tracks. He must have noticed my absence. Fuck. No fuck. How did that happen? He whispered and frantically ran down the remaining steps. He walked to the middle of the room, luckily without noticing me. His back was facing me, and that's when I knew that I'd have to act now. Fueled with adrenaline, anger, and pure animalistic strength, I ran up behind him, and before he even knew what was happening to him, I'd already jumped on his back and tackled him down. I turned him around so he would face me and placed both of my knees on his arms so he'd have no way to move. And this was the first time I'd seen him express actual emotion. Gone was his confidence and his smugness. Instead, he looked puzzled, shocked, and surprised. "How did you?" he started, but was quickly cut off at the sight of my self-made weapon. I looked him dead in the eyes and raised the cue stick over my head. And oh Mike and Owen, I brought it down with full force. The moment the peg pierced his chest, He let out a god-awful, inhuman scream, so loud that I had to cover my ears and run to the other side of the room. From my position, I could see Adam's mouth stretching open so far that I'd though he would rip his cheeks. His eyes then started glowing fiery red, and his whole body started trembling. Then this horrible stench filled the room. It smelled putrid, like someone was burning long decomposed roadkill, fur and all. I almost threw up right there at the spot. Adam's body started twisting, and that's when I noticed that his skin color was changing from a normal, healthy tan to a greenish gray. After a minute, his screams died down and transformed into a raspy, silent groan. His body jerked up one last time, only to fall back immediately. I waited another 5 minutes to make sure that he really wasn't moving or making any other sounds before I slowly walked up to his body. His mouth was still open wide in a silent scream, and the fire had left his eyes. That deep, intense brown that used to frame his pupil was gone, replaced by a lifeless, milky color. I retreaded the stick from his chest. There was not a single drop of blood on it. I'd just killed a vampire. A middle-aged English history teacher from New Jersey, had just killed a real motherfucking vampire. Supernatural powers, my ass. With a tight grip on my wooden stick, I went up the stairs. I knew that Adam's little family up there would probably jump me and tear me to shreds the second they saw me, and I was certain they'd hear the commotion coming from the basement. The door from the basement opened up into a little hallway that ended in the kitchen. I quickly made my way through the house to find the stairs leading up to the bedrooms. There were 3 doors, one that was slightly ajar and I could see a bathroom behind. One had a little sign with the name Zach on it, so I assumed it was the kid's bedroom. So I slowly opened up the door to my left, still gripping my cue stick so tightly that my knuckles were turning white. Adam's wife, widow, was still fast asleep in her bed. That's where I hesitated. In literally every tale I'd heard about vampires, they'd always sleep through the day and be active at night. But thinking back to what had just happened in the basement, I brushed off those thoughts. They probably have to do this to seem like a normal family and not blow their cover. I tiptoed over to the bed, raised my stake, and stabbed her in the chest. I'd almost forgotten how loud those screams were, and the full volume of it threw me down to the ground. A minute later, after I was certain she was dead, I pulled the stick out of her chest and turned around. A little boy, he must have been around 6, stood in the doorway, looking at me wide-eyed. I'm not proud of what I did next, but you have to remind yourselves that this was not some ordinary boy. Just like his father and his mother, he was a blood-sucking, evil, ancient entity that would grow up to kidnap and kill people just like his father. It wasn't easy, trust me, but those puppy dog eyes were just a facade, trust me. He perished in the same way as his parents. I left the stick and his lifeless body behind me, stumbled down the stairs, and exited the house. Outside, I was met with bright lights. The noises had woken up the entire neighborhood, and everyone was outside on their front lawn, looking at me. In the distance, I could hear sirens and police cars approaching. It dawned on me. With tears in my eyes, I dropped to my knees and put my arms behind my head. The first police car stopped right in front of me and 3 officers got out. "Sir, I need you to stay right where you are," one of them said to me while pointing his gun at me, while the other 2 entered the house. This is not what it looks like. I managed to get out, but I knew that he didn't hear me. It didn't matter anyway. After all, I just murdered a seemingly innocent little family from the suburbs of New Jersey. Second story. I am a vampire hunter. I guess you could say I'm a vampire hunter. I know what you're thinking. Vampires aren't real. But that's what they want you to think. You see, I was like you once, I used to think that vampires were just fairy tales. It wasn't until a few weeks ago I discovered the truth. I was at the courthouse. My wife and I were finishing with our divorce proceedings. Seated across from me in the lobby was a tall, slender man. He had black, slicked-back hair. His features were sharp and protruding, his skin a pale white. At first glance, there wasn't anything overly curious about the man, until I saw him open his mouth to yawn. Fangs. Long, glistening white fangs. Without a doubt in my mind, I knew that very instant what he was. You might think that a bit rash, but something deep down in the pit of my gut told me this man was unnatural. Out of curiosity, I waited around to see where the man went. Not surprisingly, he waited until the sun set to leave. I followed him to the parking garage where I watched him climb into a black Lexus. I quickly got into my car and followed him as he headed out of town. We drove for a good 20 to 30 minutes into the country. I pulled back as he slowed down and turned into a driveway. It was a rather unsuspecting house. A large, 2-story with a 3-car garage. Not the typical vampire lair. But I knew I had to trust my instincts. Besides, it's not like there are a lot of castles in our area. The following weeks, I kept a close tab on the man. I would park my car a few miles out and hike back to his house. I hid myself within a dense thicket across the street. I quickly came to realize that the man never left his house during the day. Like clockwork, he would leave around 8 or 9 every night and wouldn't come back home until the sun was just about to rise. Still not enough proof for you? Well, it gets more interesting. Almost every morning, upon his return before sunrise, he would have a woman accompany him into the house. Every day it was a different woman, a blonde, a redhead, a brunette. They would stay inside for hours, until normally around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, a taxicab would arrive to pick them up. They would always look exhausted. They stumbled as they walked, their hair strewn about, their clothes wrinkled. And not surprisingly, no same woman ever showed up twice. Each of them, within a matter of time, would be like him, a vampire. I knew after 2 long weeks that I had more than enough evidence. Now was the time to do something about it, to stop this monster once and for all. I began to read extensively on how to destroy a vampire. Some of the more gruesome methods worried me as I am no fan of violence or blood. The easiest method, in my opinion, was a stake through the heart. So that's what I settled on. I went to Lowe's and purchased a mallet and some wood from the hardware store. I laid out 5 stakes. Not sure why I did so many. Thinking about it now, if I were to fail with one stake, I certainly wouldn't have had time to use the others. I packed up the materials into a duffel bag and headed out to his house. I waited until early in the afternoon, as I was sure he would be asleep at that point. I snuck into the backyard and reached the back patio door. I pulled on it, hoping luck would be on my side. And it was. I slid the door open quietly and entered the house. Again, nothing unsettling or unsuspecting was within. Then again, I wasn't sure what to expect from the residence of a vampire. I made my way through his kitchen. In a bowl with car keys, I noticed a hospital badge. A doctor. How clever he was. What better place to find victims? What better place to find blood? As I arrived in the foyer, I heard heavy snoring from upstairs. Slowly, I made my way to the master bedroom. The room was dark, very dark. I placed the duffel bag on the floor and pulled out a stake and the mallet. I tiptoed quietly to his bedside. He lay there naked, a bed sheet covering only his male parts. His mouth was wide open as he snored. The fangs were glistening in the darkness. My heart raced as I placed the stake just above his skin. Doubts and fears raced through my mind, but I knew what had to be done. I raised the mallet up in the air and with all the force I could muster, I struck down on the stake. His eyes shot open immediately. He let out a gurgled squeal. I hadn't hit the heart. I raised the mallet back up, his eyes meeting mine. I felt my body weakening. I was losing grip on the mallet. No, I yelled at myself. Finish this. Again, with all my strength, I slammed the mallet down on the stake until only its blood-soaked end was visible. His body fell limp. His eyes rolled into the back of his head. A blood-curdling scream from behind me made me jump out of my skin. I spun around to find my ex-wife. "Alan," she cried. She rushed at me, anger and hatred in her eyes. She had been turned. The stakes. I had left them at the door foolishly. She jumped on me, tackling me to the ground. She swung at me, striking me feverishly across the face. I managed to get my hand around her neck. What a horrible mistake that was. She bit down on my arm. The pain was excruciating. With the little strength I had left, I pushed her off and rushed out the door. I got to my car and raced home. I locked the door and barricaded myself in my office. Alas, that brings me to the present, where I now sit here, likely minutes away from turning into one of them, an undead monster. I'm writing here so that my story is known, that vampires are real, regardless of what they say. So before I put this bullet in my head, to stop the inevitable turn, I want you all to know that what I say is true. Don't trust what the media will say about me. My cheating whore of an ex-wife and her playboy doctor boyfriend are in fact dirty, lousy, no-good bloodsuckers. Third story. I think a vampire may be stalking me. While I can't be sure if it's a vampire, an immortal, or any other type of supernatural being, the fact is that ever since I was a little girl, I've periodically seen this strange man looking at me from afar, not saying anything, not moving, just staring at me, like he wants to say something, but he never does. Now, why am I suggesting that he may be a vampire? For starters, his looks never change. He seems to never age. I saw him again last week, and he looks exactly the same as he did when I saw him for the first time 12 years ago. And sure, 12 years is not that much time, and someone can perfectly still look the same after that amount of years, but it's not even that. He still wears the same medieval-type clothes, he's never cut his long white hair, and he still looks like an albino goth cosplayer who's never changed his costume. I know, that still may not warrant calling him a vampire, but here's what makes me think so. Apparently, no one but me is able to see him. You'd think that a guy who looks like that and who's about 6 feet tall, just standing and staring in place, would be sufficient for all people around him to at least give him a glance. But nothing. Also, when I was little, I would tell my friends at the playground to look at him, just for them to see nothing and call me crazy, and the one time I told my mom, she thought that I had created an imaginary friend and just played along with it. After that, I've never told anyone when this guy has paid me his usual visits just to stare at me. And sure, am I schizophrenic? I know that it's super easy to reach that conclusion, to be honest. For a long time I thought so too, and at one point I almost asked my mom to take me to a shrink. But, as if he was reading my mind, in one of his visits he waved at me from behind the tree he was standing at, and something flashed in one of his hands. He dropped whatever he was holding to the floor, and then vanished into thin air. I was sadly used to his disappearing act by then. Needless to say, I was totally nervous to walk there, but curiosity got the most of me, and I just went to that tree to see what he had dropped. It was a really strange and old-looking medallion, almost freezing cold to the touch. And so, how do I know I'm not schizophrenic? I took the medallion home and showed it to my mom, and she was able to see it, even touch it and hold it. I had not been imagining that guy. He really has been there every time I have seen him. I had finally convinced myself of that. I just made up a story to my mom that I had found the medallion among the boxes in the room of my late grandma, because I knew she would have insisted in me returning it somehow or giving it to the police, because it actually looks like it's worth a lot, and, for some reason, I told my mom I wanted to keep it as an heirloom, and she, eventually, agreed. I guess I wanted to keep it as a self-assurance that I'm not crazy, and it has worked so far. This man has never hurt me, he has never come to my house, has never called my phone, written me letters or emailed me or anything of the sort. So probably calling what he's been doing is stalking may not be the right way to go, but after last week, I can't be sure anymore. See, the problem is that I moved almost 7,000 miles from home as soon as I turned 18 just to start a new life and pursue my personal goals, and for a couple of months, I thought everything was okay. And then last fricking week, I saw him again. All the way here, just a block from my new home. I can't even explain what I felt then. This mix of desperation, terror, amazement, anger, but also strange familiarity. This guy has been watching me almost all my life, and even though I still not dare confront him, he has become my own deepest fear to overcome, and I know that someday I will. Someday. I know I will. Someday. Fourth story. I'm a vampire. Pale skin. White hair. Red eyes. That's what I see every time I look into the mirror. You might be wondering, if I'm a vampire, how could I see my reflection? I get asked that a lot, and it still makes me laugh every time. Garlic, holy water, mirrors. All of it she old superstitions. All of it just as reliable as your grandmother's remedies. You know the ones, with the lemon water and a hint of rye. It's just as fatal to a vampire as it would be to you. Steaks and sunlight? That's a whole nother story. Steaks will kill us, that's for sure. Then again, what wouldn't that kill? Sharp piece of wood through the heart? Yeah, that's gonna sting a bit. Sunlight, though, it doesn't kill like it does in the movies. It's more of a gradual effect. It slowly chars and burns our skin until it almost causes us to overload. It's slow, but painful, so most of my kind try to avoid it like the plague. The last difference? We're not the mighty race you might have heard of. Not anymore. We've been contained by your governments, forced to live our extremities in small, uniform bedrooms. Sterile whites and surgical steels stare at me from every corner, while the faint smell of sanitizer pervades my senses. It's a special kind of hell, just for us. They don't deprive us of our blood, though. They grant us that small mercy. It may be through and four, and not nearly regular enough to regain my full strength, but it's something. Beyond that, this place is as cold as our skin. Senseless, impartial, almost clinical. Very clinical, actually. They poke and prod me almost daily, taking samples of blood, saliva, and other bodily fluids. It's uncivilized, and as ironic as this may sound, dehumanizing. They likely wish to find the source of our abilities, masking it under the guise of medical examinations. They hide us in plain sight. They place us with families, using our weakened forms as the perfect alibi. That was their first mistake. When people see us, surrounded by doting loved ones, they underestimate us. They believe us to be just a sickly person, to be pitied and admired for their tenacity. For some, that's all they are. Having been raised their whole lives to genuinely believe in their illness. But we know that is a lie. The blood they give fuels us, invigorates us. The more the better. But they give us just enough to survive, believing that starving us just enough will keep us weak, keep us complacent. And they're right. But it's that truth that will be their undoing. The rallying of my people has begun. It will start small, and it will be unnoticeable. We will withhold our blood, and we will stockpile. We'll gather our people and prepare. The uprising is coming, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Our time is now, and our bondage has ended. I send this message, not as a warning, but as a rallying call. Many of you will bypass this as a piece of fiction, and that is exactly what I intend. But for those of you that read this and feel a burning in your blood, a longing for absentia, you know I am right. The time has come for you to realize your true self, to shed the moniker of your sickness. No more will be go by that wretched name. Gone is the time of albinism. Now is the time of vampires. Fifth story. I think I'm turning into a vampire. I think I'm turning into a vampire. I'm looking for anyone who can help me, either with changing that, or with finding the bitch who turned me into this thing. A few weeks ago, I went to the bar looking for booze. I had a terrible day. My boss threw a bunch of books and made me cry. The bread I intended to use as a part of my lunchtime sandwich was moldy and greenish. To top it all off, I found out that my ex started dating a new girl. It's not a good way of coping, I know, and I knew deep down that it was unsafe for me to go to bars outside of a group, but, truth be told, I didn't really care. I wanted to get up, and I wanted to do it alone. I wanted to be a mess where nobody knew me. Was that such a crime? Betty, I told myself, tonight is not a night for sexiness. And it wasn't. I went out of my way to make sure that wasn't the case. I wasn't looking for a hookup. I was looking to get trashed and then go back home. What happened with Maribel was a complete accident. I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans that were both 2 sizes too big, preserved from back before my ex urged me to lose so much weight. I didn't brush my hair before going out either. I'm an emotional drinker, so by the time I was on my 4th drink, I was openly weeping. What was left of my mascara was running down my face. Unfortunately, it was also getting into my mouth. I didn't try to do anything more than wiping it away with greasy fists before sipping on a pint of beer I knew I wouldn't be able to finish. I don't know how or why she came up to me, but she did. Maybe it was that I looked vulnerable. Whatever it was, she started talking to me. Maribel was sitting right next to me, listening to me mumble about my ex, nursing her own fruity-looking drink. Maribel, that was her name. Or, at least, she told me that was her name. I'm beginning to doubt that was the case at all. She also told me that she was up over an ex too, that something happened between them and she wasn't sure how to feel about that. Maribel told me all sorts of things while we were in a cab, riding toward her apartment. Maribel was tall, with nearly perfect red lipstick that lingered on her straw but not on her spotless white teeth. She wore this tight little dark red dress that hugged every curve on her body, and her long, blonde hair hung in ringlets, tightly coiled, that fell to her shoulders. She wore a black sun hat and sunglasses with amber lenses, even indoors, even at night. She was distinguished, polished, and pristine. Her house certainly wasn't. Most of the night I got there is a black blur I can't quite remember. There was a massive blood stain on one couch cushion, like someone had gotten their period there and had forgotten to clean it up. There was a well-loved collection of Paul Blart and Mormon cinema DVDs stacked by the television. There were other things, like mismatched throw pillows and threadbare blankets. None of it seemed to match the way Maribel had presented herself to me back at the bar. I was worried about it for a moment, like maybe this was her ex's place and she had some weird ulterior motive for bringing me here. And then I wasn't. Overcome by a mixture of heartbreak, grief, alcohol, and lust, I planted a weird, sloppy kiss between her eye and her cheek, then trailed down to her mouth. My hands were on hers, and her were on me, and, well, we don't need to get into that. Truth be told, I don't even remember most of it. When I woke up the next morning, naked and wrapped in sheets that weren't mine, on a hard mattress and a broken metal bed frame. I felt off, sick, hungover, maybe, but also, it was like something was wrong with me, but I didn't know what it was just yet. My head was simultaneously pounding and overwhelmingly light. It took me a while to piece together what had happened the night before, and when I finally did, I was filled with a bitter kind of regret and a weird kind of hunger. Maribel left me a note explaining that she had work to do and that she didn't want to leave me, but had to. She also wrote that there was a breakfast sandwich I could have in the fridge and a glass of water and some meds on the bedside table. It was a Sunday and I didn't have much to do, so I did what I had to in order to get home, and I spent the rest of the day in bed, nursing whatever weird hangover I had. The thing was, I wasn't really able to get up the next day either. I ended up sleeping in my bathtub because of everything that was happening to me. It was a myriad of vomiting, diarrhea, constant chills, and crying. I'll spare you the exact details. No matter how much water I drank, I felt like I would never be satiated again. By day 3, I was able to stand, however shakily. I lifted myself out of the mildew-stricken space between the toilet and the tub and braced myself on the porcelain, counterless sink. I looked at myself in the mirror. I barely recognized the woman I saw across from me. I was pale. My hair was thinner than it had been before, closer to my Nana's than my sister's. My pupils were huge, like I was high. That might have explained the reason my warm yellow ceiling tit light was so goddamn bright, even though I only had one bulb in it. The part that stood out most, though, was the bite. It was huge and ghastly. The bite was surrounded by a yellow and purple bruise. 2 long, deep holes, about an inch apart on my neck. I wasn't sure what it was, if it was infected, or if I should bandage it. I was only sure of 2 things. 1. Maribel had done this. There was no doubt about it. This was her fault. I didn't have this before going back to her place, and now I did. 2. I was starving and thirsty, like I hadn't eaten in days. I hadn't, of course, not really. Everything I got down was quickly reintroduced to porcelain or linoleum. Every part of the brat diet was there, caked, dried, and probably impossible to clean up in its flakes of bile. But the thirst, that didn't make sense to me. I had water when I was in the shower. I would drink it in trembling, cupped hands. It wasn't like I was in a desert. I shouldn't have been so dehydrated. I convinced myself that it was a problem with my electrolytes. I knew I had half a white Gatorade or Powerade or something in the door of my fridge, plus about 1,000 bottles of spring water. I steadied myself on the wall and made my way to the plastic countertops of my tiny little shoebox of a kitchen space. When I opened my fridge, though, it wasn't the sports drink I reached for. There was a styrofoam container of meat in a brown plastic bag on the bottom shelf, and I had completely forgotten it was there until I opened the door and the smell hit me. It was on the train to Rotville, but that wasn't the smell that piqued my interest. It was more like the meat itself, or maybe all the juices in it, were calling to me. That was what I reached for. The meat. Every bite of rancid beef roast disgusted and thrilled me. I knew it had gone bad long ago, but I couldn't stop myself from eating every last bit, drinking in every last drop from the styrofoam and the plastic shrink wrap in my fingers and even the plastic bag the roast had been in. When it was all done and the packaging was licked clean, I was disgusted. I was disgusted with myself, above all else. Here I was, a grown-ass woman, sitting on the warm tiles of my kitchen floor with my foot holding open the fridge like a door jamb, devouring old meat like a starved tiger in an exotic zoo, trying to block out the sunlight that was stinging my skin and the incessant sound of the swamp cooler buzzing. I went to the kitchen sink and tried to Ralph it all up, but I couldn't. It wouldn't come out of me. And the worst part was, I wasn't hungry anymore. I was satisfied. I didn't feel nearly as sick as I had just 4 minutes prior. This kept happening. I went back to work on Tuesday. The workday was uneventful. I work at an elementary school as a librarian, so most of my day is reading to kindergartners and checking out piles of books to precocious fourth graders. I got a sunburn on the way to and from my car. Nobody asked me many questions. They just wished me well and hoped I was feeling better. I went to the grocery store that night to get some milk, eggs, cheese, and cleaning supplies. I was out of all of them, and I was planning on tackling the bile on the bathroom floor and the side of the toilet. Things were supposed to get back to normal. I was supposed to find pleasure in quarts of mint ice cream with chocolate ribbons, in the promise of English muffins with pads of margarine melting gently, and in stupid pop songs and announcements over the intercom. I didn't, though. Over and over again, over the course of the next week, I found myself going to the grocery store with every intention of getting normal food. Over and over again, I found myself standing in front of the meat display, filling my basket with all sorts of ground beef, round steaks, anything and everything that still had blood in it. It was like I was possessed. I piled them high in the green plastic basket and, before I knew what I was doing, I was already done at the self-checkout, having spent my entire paycheck on the stuff. I told myself I would cook it, but I didn't. I never did. Over and over again I found myself in my car or my doorway or just inside the kitchen, having eaten every last muscle fiber and drunken every last drop of inhuman blood. I would come to several minutes later and try to make myself puke it all up, but I couldn't. Then there was the roadkill thing. Someone hit a skunk out on one of the back roads I used to bypass the freeway on my way to work. It was fresh. The maggots hadn't set in yet. The yellow lights of this small street out of town illuminated it like a shadowy figure, like a snack cake in a commercial I saw once when I was younger. I was salivating to the point where drool was spilling out of my lips. I couldn't stop myself. I pulled over and, before I was aware of what I was doing, I was on my hands and knees, devouring. It was something analogous to my very own blowfly girl moment, only I felt infinitely more shame than she ever did. I couldn't stop myself, not even when the fur caught in my teeth. That was when I knew, while driving back to my home and taking in the skunk's scent from all over my body, that something was deeply, horribly wrong with me. I wanted to think it was some sort of compulsion, like pica. I'd heard of people eating clay, chalk, rubber, dirt, their own skin. Anything and everything was an option. Was it so far off to think that maybe my compulsive eating of raw meat was something like that? It didn't feel like a compulsion. That was where I couldn't fool myself. It felt more like I was losing control of myself every time it happened, and that maybe I would never be able to regain that again. The wound on my neck wasn't getting any better, either. I bandaged it like I had always taught myself to, but nothing ever really changed. It was just as ghastly, if a little less bruised. But I was coping. I was coping pretty well with it, in my opinion. I was fine with this little secret of mine, for a time. It was shameful, but I was living with it. I was getting through it. It didn't stop there, though. There was the meat and the roadkill, the sudden hate for pasta sauce and the garlic and herb margarine spread in my fridge, and increasingly complicated feelings about churches. These were things I could cope with. These were things I could work around. I started keeping rubber gloves and cans of air freshener in my car to distract myself so I wouldn't go after roadkill again. I started ordering my groceries instead of going into the store. When I started to get weak, shaky, and physically ill, I ignored it. When I started puking up every meal I had minutes after eating it, I kept that shit a secret. I tried my best. I considered going to the doctor but chickened out every time. I dealt with what was happening to me in whatever ways I could. I can't keep doing that anymore. See, I work at an elementary school. I'm the librarian, but I frequently fill in for the teachers during recess when I don't have a storytime circle to lead. Long story short, I was supervising recess at the time. The kids were playing werewolf tag, a game where they pretended to be werewolves while chasing each other around on the blacktop. There was an entire set of rules and politics that I didn't quite get, and that don't quite matter here and now. What does matter is that Jordan Wozniak pushed little Andre Altamont when he was trying to tag him and, as a result, Andre skinned his knee. Bright red blood welled up in the little cuts and abrasions, threatening to spill over like the tears in his eyes. I did what I was supposed to do. Took him to the nurse to get him bandaged up, brought him back out to the bus loop when he said he felt better. But, I swear to God, that was the hardest thing I had ever done. I wanted to literally tear into him. I wanted to rip him apart. I wanted to put my mouth on his knee and drink his blood like he was a Capri Sun. It was like there was an animal inside of me that was trying to claw its way out of my throat, and I'm disgusted. I hate myself for that. I have never once wanted to hurt a child, and I'm not about to start. I think I have to quit my job to keep it that way. I'm fine with doing that. I'll do anything to protect those kids. I can't lose control of myself, not in a place like an elementary school. About an hour later, I was sitting in the library while one group of kids went back to their classroom, waiting for the next group of kids to come in to check out books. That was when it clicked for me. I had enough time alone to think about what was going on, and that was when I realized there was something wrong with me, more than the roadkill and the raw meat, and it all started with Maribel. She must have bitten me that night. She must have turned me into what she already was. That leaves me with one giant realization, glaring, unignorable. I am turning into a vampire. Even now, as I type this, I can feel the teeth in my mouth and the hunger growing inside me. I know that my heart isn't beating. I know that my stomach isn't digesting any of the normal food I've been eating. I don't know what to do. I think I might drive out to Home Depot this weekend and get some steaks from the garden center. Maybe a gun will do the trick, or maybe I can reverse this. That last option seems unlikely. I think I'm already too far gone. Either way, I can't go on like this. If anyone has any advice, I would appreciate it. If not, then I'm going to have to take that trip this upcoming Friday.